Today our dissection will cover the digestive system. Just like the human digestive system is responsible for the mechanical and chemical breakdown of food and absorption of nutrients, the mink digestive system does the same. And you're going to see a lot of the same organs and same functions of those organs as we work through looking at the digestive system of the mink. We didn't cover teeth when we talked about the digestive system in humans, but I am going to talk a little bit about the types of teeth that are in the mink, and we will compare them to the human teeth as well. So the mink have 5 types of teeth. The incisors, which nip and tear at the flesh of the prey. The canines, which puncture flesh of the prey and actually will hold the prey because they can kind of dig deep into the meat of whatever the mink is attacking. And then we have premolars, carnassials, and molars, and they all will tear through tendons and crush bones, so they're like what we're using for chewing. And we have incisors, canines, premolars, and molars as humans. We're lacking the carnassials. So the function of the teeth in the mink, we have the same function with our teeth, except our canines. When I show you which teeth are the canines on the picture here, the canines are more, ours aren't as long in a human versus the mink, because we're not killing live animals like the mink are when they're hunting their prey. So that's the difference there. So incisors are going to be these front teeth, those really tiny front teeth in between the big canines. So that's the incisors. The canines are these really sharp, long teeth, and actually if we were working with the mink and dissecting in class, you would actually have to be very careful when you are trying to open the mouth and look at the interior of the mouth. You'd have to be very careful of those canines because they can puncture your skin. They're very, very sharp. So those are the canines. And premolars, carnassials, and molars are all here in the back, and they go in that order. So we would have premolars right after the canines, the carnassials would come next, and then the molars all the way in the back. And they all kind of have the same function, which is to crush bone and chew and make the things that the mink are eating much smaller and then easier to swallow. I also have on this picture, or on this slide, a picture of an actual mink and somebody holding the mouth open, and you can see those really long canines that would be puncturing and holding its prey until the whatever it's eating dies, and they can continue to feast on what they caught. So that's the mink dentition. Dentition just means teeth. And we're going to move on now to talk a little bit about the salivary glands. And the salivary glands in a mink, I don't have a really good picture to show you, but there is a good picture in your lab manual when you go through and look at those pictures. There's 2 sets of salivary glands, the parotid and the mandibular. And again, they're secreting saliva, moistening the food. There's some salivary amylase in the saliva that is going to break down the starches that the mink would eat. So very, very similar. We have 3 sets of salivary glands as humans. Mink only have 2 sets, the parotid and the mandibular. We have sublingual as well. Now here's a picture of the mouth open, where the sides of the mouth were cut open, and we could open the mouth very, very wide so we can get a look at the interior of the mouth. There's a couple things that I want you to be able to see in the mouth, and that would be the hard palate, and the soft palate is right behind the hard palate. in this area would be the soft palate. Also in this picture you can see the tongue, and there are papillae on the tongue, or taste buds if you want to call them that, and there's 3 types: the fungiform, the filiform, and the valate. The fungiform are in the very front, so that would be in this area here, and then working your way back to the valate, which would be all the way on the back of the tongue, and the filiforms in between those two. So those are the papillae on the tongue. And then one other thing that I want you to take note of, and I am going to erase some things here so that you can see it a little bit better. I would zoom in so you could see this too. I'm unable to do that on Doceri. But right here, if you look closely, you can kind of see that protrusion in that area at the back of the tongue, and that is the epiglottis. Probably one of my favorite things to find when I'm dissecting. That and the trachea are my 2 favorites. It's just very, very amazing to kind of be able to see these organs when you're dissecting. So that's the epiglottis, and that's what's going to cover your larynx when you swallow. The mink has one too, and it does exactly the same thing. When the mink swallows food, the epiglottis will cover the larynx. So now we're going to move on to the neck area that is exposed in this picture, and you're going to be able to see the trachea and the esophagus. And what I would like you to notice, 2 things. One, that the esophagus is dorsal to the trachea. Dorsal meaning it is towards the back, or it's behind the trachea. The trachea is right here, and it runs right along with the esophagus. Actually, you have to separate the trachea and the esophagus from each other because there's connective tissue that are holding those 2 or tubes together. So the trachea is made of cartilaginous rings. Those cartilage rings hold the trachea airway or windpipe open so it doesn't collapse while you're breathing. And then the esophagus is what's being held up kind of with this scalpel type thing, or probe I should say. It's not a scalpel, it's a probe. Is kind of holding the esophagus there. So that's the esophagus. And what you should notice about the esophagus is that it's more muscular. There's nothing that's going to hold that esophagus open as far as cartilage, like the trachea. So the esophagus, it doesn't matter if the esophagus collapses or it's collapsed when it's not being used because it's muscular. And the muscles are what are going to move the food when food gets into the esophagus. So they have very different structures between them. The trachea needs the cartilage rings to keep it open because we don't want our windpipe collapsing. And the esophagus is more muscular. So you can see those differences if you look closely at that photo. And as we follow the esophagus, it actually runs through the diaphragm. So because it goes through the thoracic cavity, and then it's going to run through the diaphragm. And this is the diaphragm right here. And it connects to the stomach, which is located just under the diaphragm. The stomach's not in this picture, but there are a couple things that I want you to be aware of in this picture. The liver, which we will get back to, and also the gallbladder. So those are some things that you can also look at in this photo. Okay, but I like to look at that diaphragm. It's a very, very strong muscle, and it separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. And now we're going to move into the abdominal cavity and look at the stomach next. And on this slide you can see that the probe is pointing to the stomach. so I don't really need to label it there with an arrow. And the stomach is pretty interesting in a mink because it holds large amounts of food so that the mink can go longer periods of time between eating. So it works slightly different than our stomach. Our stomach will take in little bits of food and it will digest it as it goes, and when we get hungry we eat again. In the case of the mink, though, they can go longer periods of time between eating, so they're going to eat a lot of food, and then they're going to go someplace and they're going to rest and digest that food, and it allows them to not need to eat every few hours. They can go much longer periods of time. The stomach also will produce hydrochloric acid and pepsinogens, just like in a human stomach, and start the breakdown of proteins. So the stomach works very much the same way as a human stomach in as far as chemical digestion. And so that's the stomach. And on this picture you can see the interior of the stomach. They've cut the stomach open, and I actually have you guys do this in class so you can first see what's inside the stomach, and secondly you can check to see if you can find those rugae. And in this stomach you can see all of the folds of the rugae that help with expansion, but they also help with mixing the food in the stomach. To the left of the stomach, on the ventral surface, we see the spleen. And the spleen is in the abdominal cavity, but it is not a digestive organ. It is more of a circulatory organ, and the spleen, just going to circle it here for you guys, is right here. So it kind of lays on the stomach. It's lateral to the stomach, or more towards the side of the mink, and it sits along the greater curvature of the stomach. And again, it's a circulatory organ. It actually takes in red blood cells and recycles red blood cells that are not working. And so it will pull red blood cells in and recirculate them and send them back out into the body. Now, there's lots of things that we can see in this picture. We can still see the stomach, but we're going to focus a little bit on the liver right here. And the stomach lies underneath the liver, and the liver has 5 lobes. I'm not going to label those lobes. They're labeled much better in your dissection manual, so I would take a look at the pictures that are in your dissection manual. But we have a left and right lateral lobe, a left and right medial lobe, and we have a quadrate lobe. The quadrate lobe is what houses the gallbladder. So you kind of have to pull through the lobes to find the gallbladder. It's very, very small, but it is green. The bile is green, so that's what colors the gallbladder green. So it's always shown green in pictures that you look at, and it actually does have a very dark green color. So that is the liver. And the stomach. And also, I'm going to get to this, but the small intestines are located in this area, but they're all covered now by what we call the mesentery, and we're going to take a look at that on another slide. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the gallbladder. I keep doing that. The gallbladder is this green organ right here in the fossa of the quadrate lobe. And you can see again that it is a green color. You can also see the diaphragm right here, and we have the lungs of the thoracic cavity cranial to the diaphragm. Now on the picture to the right, we're going to look at a couple things here. The gallbladder is right here, and then there's this little, let's see if I can get my arrow a little closer. That little area there, that is the cystic duct. And if you remember, the cystic duct has bile flowing in from the common hepatic duct into the gallbladder, and it also allows bile to flow out of the gallbladder. So it's a two-way street. You can have bile going in, or you can have bile going out. So that's the cystic duct of the digestive or accessory organs. And this slide here is showing the greater omentum. And the greater omentum is all of this connective tissue that's holding the small intestines in place in the abdominal cavity. So it covers and holds the small intestines in place. And on this slide, I wanted to show you something that you would have done had you been dissecting in class, is you would have pulled the small intestines out to kind of measure them and see how long they are. It's kind of amazing to see because they're packed so tightly into the abdominal cavity, you don't realize how long they actually are until you pull them out. So I like to show that picture. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the small intestine. All that yellow stuff that's kind of in there is mesentery and fat. The mesentery is what holds the small intestines kind of all coiled together. I don't have a really great picture of that, but when you try to uncoil the small intestine, you have to kind of break the mesentery so that you can get it all stretched out like is shown in the picture on the left. So this is the small intestine exposed with the greater omentum removed. Okay, there's a few things that I want you to see on this particular picture. We have the stomach for one, and it's moving into, and the probe is kind of showing this, the pyloric sphincter. And if you were able to feel that area, you would be able to feel the sphincter because it's a massive kind of muscular area and it's a little bit harder. And so as you were feeling along in the duodenum, between the stomach and the duodenum, you would be able to feel that sphincter. And then we move on to this area, which is the small intestine, but this part is called the duodenum. And I just realized I'm going to have to erase that because I covered up the pancreas. So that is the duodenum, and in that area of the duodenum sits in that curvature of the duodenum sits the pancreas. So let me just erase that because that was not a good place for me to write that. But right here is the pancreas. And then I'll just rewrite duodenum up here so it's not as crowded for you to see. Okay. The pancreas actually is embedded in that mesentery that holds the small intestines together, and it has two lobes. It has a right and a left lobe. I don't have a really great picture of both lobes, but just to kind of give you an idea of where it's located. It does do the same exact thing that the pancreas does in the human. It secretes hormones to get digestion started and to also cease digesting in the stomach. And it also releases all the enzymes needed to break down the macromolecules that were eaten, break them down into nutrients so they can be absorbed into the small intestines and then into the body. So the pancreas has the exact same function as it would in the human. And this is just another picture of the same thing on the last slide. You can see the stomach is here, the pyloric sphincter would be here, the duodenum is here, and then this whole area here would be the pancreas. So you can get a better look at it in this picture. So again, stomach, pyloric sphincter, duodenum, pancreas. Now it's really challenging to see a change from the small intestine to the large intestine. I know in pictures it shows a really drastic change, but the mink is small, and so it's really hard to see that change from the small intestine to large intestine. You'll see that the diameter of the small intestine becomes ever so slightly larger as it moves into the large intestine, and you can sort of see that here. I'll put an arrow to the part where that change occurs to the large intestine. And there's no cecum in the mink. So we have a cecum as humans, but mink have no cecum. So there's a difference between the intestine area between mink and humans. So we have small intestine here going to the large intestine here, and you can kind of see that change in diameter in that area if you look closely. And after moving through the large intestine, we come to the rectum, and the rectum is this area right here, and the feces are egested from the body through the anus. I don't have a really good picture of the anus, but I do want you to make sure that you understand the difference between excretion and egestion. Egestion is getting rid of solid materials from the digestive tract, which is very different than excretion. Excretion is from the excretory system, which we'll be talking about after the respiratory system. So make sure you understand the difference between those two terms. It is talked about in your dissection manual, and I think it's a question in your journal as well. And so after watching this video, you should definitely make sure you're looking at the digestive system lab reading found in the lab manual folder on the class page. There are several very short video clips. Most of them are about a minute or less, showing the dissection of the abdominal cavity of the mink. Very interesting to see because it's live action versus just seeing pictures on this video presentation. And remember, you should be keeping up on your journal and working along as it's shown in the lesson plans. You don't want to get far behind because then you'll have a lot of work to do all at the end when the journal is due. Hope you guys are doing well and you enjoyed that video lesson on the digestive system. Next, we'll be talking about the respiratory system.